Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Lily. I'm the events coordinator here at Politics Prose, where we're now hosting in-person and virtual events along with partners, support events, trips, classes. For a full list of everything, you can go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I just have a few housekeeping things. So first, I'd just like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so we don't disrupt our program today. And then, of course, when we get to the opening floor to your questions, we have a microphone stand right here behind this white pillar. So for some of you, it's hidden, but it'll be there when you come up to it. So we just asked you to line up at the white pillar for the microphone and speak clearly into it so that your question can be heard at the audio recording of our event. And along those lines, we're both audio and video recording today's program, so you or anyone you know can find it back at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. And then following the Q&A that we're having today, we'll have a signing line right up here at the table next to me. So if you haven't purchased your book, you can purchase it. We have many copies available at the front of the store. And we'll ask you to line up, again, starting at the white pillar. And we'll come by and ask you if your name to be personalized, so just have your books out and ready for us to personalize. And then once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy, and then we'll take care of them from there. So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Leah Redmond Chang, celebrating the release of her novel Young Queens, 3 Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. Leah Redmond Chang is a former associate professor of French literature and culture at the George Washington University. Her writing draws on her extensive experience as a researcher in the archives and in rare book libraries. Her book includes Into Print, The Invention of Female Authorship in Early Modern France, which focuses on women and book culture in the 16th century, and With Catherine Hong, Portraits of the Queen Mother, and the many public faces of Catherine de Medici. With her husband and 3 children, she lives and writes in D.C. and London, UK. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Leah Redmond Chang.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Let me first say I'm getting over a terrible case of laryngitis, so I will make it through, but if I cough a few times, please just bear with me. It is so great to be here, and it is really great to welcome the Queens finally to the United States, because they've been hanging out in Europe for a while, and it's taken them a little while to get here. So I'm so glad to be here and so glad to talk about them to you. I'm going to do a little talking, do a little reading, and while I do that, I want you to hold one idea in your head. Let's call it the Queen's Paradox, which is the phenomenon in which a queen was, in theory, endowed with tremendous power, but because she was female, in reality, she was often utterly powerless. Now, there are 3 16th century queens that headline this book, as you know. You have Catherine de Medici, Queen of France, her daughter Elisabeth de Valois, Queen of Spain, and her daughter-in-law, Mary Queen of Scots. I put them together in this book for a few reasons. First, they were family, they knew each other well, and they lived together at the court of France for a time. Secondly, they represent different kinds of queens. One is a queen mother who ruled behind the throne. One was a sovereign queen who ruled on the throne, and one was just a queen consort, which meant that she was the wife of a king. But even though they were different queens, different kinds of queens with different ranks and in different kingdoms, they all face similar challenges that have everything to do with being young and female. They all come up against this queen's paradox in different ways. So before I talk about the queens themselves, I want to set the scene a little and take you back to Europe in the middle of the 16th century. So this is the Renaissance. The time I'm talking about is a little bit after Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, but not quite yet at Elizabeth Tudor and the Spanish Armada. We're right in the middle of the century. It's a time of war. war for the domination of Europe, and war for religion. The Protestant Reformation was heating up. Europe seemed to be fracturing. England has already broken with the Catholic Church. Spain is really clamping down on heresy. The Inquisition is active. Scotland is falling fast to Protestants. And by mid-century, France was deeply divided and growing only more polarized. Our three queens are born into this polarized world. Today I'm going to talk chiefly about Elisabeth de Valois and Mary Queen of Scots because they were really the inspiration for this book, especially Elisabeth. You probably haven't really heard of Elisabeth de Valois, but that's exactly why she was interesting to me. She was born in 1546 to King Henry II of France and his wife, Catherine de Medici. She had an idyllic childhood. Her parents, especially her mother, adored her, coddled her. Elisabeth lived surrounded by siblings and playmates, including the young Mary Queen of Scots. It was really a lovely childhood, but that childhood would come to a screeching halt in 1559 because that's when Elizabeth marries King Philip II of Spain. Now, before I go on, there are a couple things that you need to know about Elisabeth and her time. This is a world of dynasty, where political alliances are made through arranged marriages between courts and kingdoms. It's a system where a girl's fertility really determines her value. Today we talk a lot about sexual trafficking of girls or the sexual exploitation of girls, but in some ways that's what dynastic marriage was. It's a political system based on the trading of young girls' bodies. And Elisabeth was just a girl when she got married. At the time of her wedding, she was just 13 years old, the age of a 7th or 8th grader. And I couldn't have planned it better, but the middle schoolers happened to all be sitting here. So this was the age that Elisabeth was when she marries Philip II of Spain. But Philip was 33. He was a grown man and a widower twice over. Elizabeth's marriage was part of a peace treaty ending generations of war between France and Spain. It was meant to be the wedding of the century, and that's how it started. But it quickly turned to tragedy when a few days after the wedding, Elizabeth's father, King Henry II, was killed in a freak jousting accident. So, as you can imagine, this was bad. This was very bad. And it's particularly bad for three reasons. First, the crown passed to Henry's 15-year-old son and his 16-year-old wife, Mary Queen of Scots. They were just teenagers. They had no idea what they were doing. Secondly, everyone in the new government was afraid that French Protestants would take advantage of the new king's youth and rise up, pushing the kingdom closer to civil war. Third, and this was most important for Elisabeth, everyone feared that Philip II of Spain would now break the peace treaty and wage war on France once again. And if France is on the brink of civil religious war, it can't afford another war with Spain. No one was more frightened of this possibility than Elizabeth's mother, Catherine de Medici. It seemed to Catherine that the only thing holding the peace together was the new bride, her daughter, Elisabeth. The problem was Elisabeth was a 13-year-old girl who still played with dolls. So these are the circumstances under which Elisabeth began her married life. It's pretty horrific. Try to be in her shoes a little bit, right? She's young, painfully young. She's completely traumatized by her father's death. She's homesick, and she's also confused. She doesn't know Spanish customs. She doesn't speak the language. And she's still really attached to France, and especially attached to her mother, Catherine, probably all the more so because of the traumatic conditions under which she left France. Now, Catherine de Medici, her mother, would take advantage of this attachment. She would count on Elizabeth's obedience. Catherine had her hands full in France with the religious mess, and she needed all the help she could get. So there was no time to let Elisabeth grow into her role as queen consort. She needed Elizabeth's help right away. Here's what she needed Elizabeth to do. She needed Elizabeth to placate Philip and keep him interested in the peace treaty. But she also needed Elizabeth sometimes to intercede in Spanish policies that Catherine didn't particularly like. And she even sometimes needed Elizabeth to spy. And Elizabeth did. So Elizabeth found herself playing the role of a loyal daughter, a French princess, and a queen consort of Spain at one and the same time. That's what Catherine was asking her to do. And it was a lot to ask of a teenage girl. But if that isn't bad enough, it's worse, because Elizabeth suffered from some sort of chronic illness. Now, we don't really know what this illness was, but she suffered from a spate of symptoms that last her entire life. They included headaches, nosebleeds. She fainted a lot. She would get nauseous. She would get sick. But worst of all, most troubling to Catherine, Elizabeth struggled with her menstrual cycle. This went on for years. She couldn't get pregnant, and both Catherine and Elizabeth knew that this was a disaster, because if Elizabeth couldn't get pregnant, she couldn't really succeed at what her mother was asking her to do. Elizabeth's story is really about a young girl held prisoner by her own body. She battled with her body. She suffered in her illness and with her infertility. There is a single rule that governed the lives of all queens. It didn't matter if they were consorts or sovereigns. A queen's first duty to her realm is to give birth to the heir. And for queens, it's really a question of survival. No queen could be secure in her marriage or on her throne until she proved her fertility. She can't expect to have any real lasting political influence until she can prove that she can have children. And here we arrive at an instance of the queen's paradox, right? Because Elizabeth might wear the crown of a queen consort, but until she has a baby, she's virtually powerless. Now, Catherine de' Medici could not afford to have Philip repudiate Elizabeth, which he had every right to do if she was barren. So, while Catherine is managing the religious mess at home, she's also working behind the scenes to help Elizabeth get pregnant in Spain. So I'm going to read a passage on this point, but before I do, let me tell you that there wasn't a single detail about Elizabeth's body that Catherine de' Medici didn't know. So Catherine is notorious for her ability to gather information. She had spies everywhere, and she had spies in Spain, and they were sending her all the details. So here we go. Surely, with God's grace, Catherine told her French ambassador, Elizabeth could conceive and bring a baby to term. Of course, Catherine was ready to assist if God required a helping hand. The Queen Mother wrote out recipes for dozens of tonics, shipping them off to Elizabeth, to her ambassador, and to Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, adding a dose of maternal pressure to the lists of ingredients. I found these very useful for having children, she wrote in one note, and I hope they will do the same for Elizabeth, because it is the thing I most desire in the world. Elizabeth hardly understood her own body, its rhythms incomprehensible, its aches and pains a mystery. Over the years, her fluctuating periods, migraines, and waves of nausea had made her body difficult to read. She was almost afraid to hope. Madame, I cannot hide from you that I don't know if I could be pregnant, Elizabeth wrote to Catherine in 1562. My ladies say I show all the signs of a pregnant woman, but I don't know if I am. I never feel sick, except for at night. If there are any certain signs, I will be sure to write to you immediately. In this, as in so many things, Elizabeth feared disappointing Catherine. I wouldn't want to lose your good opinion of me if I am mistaken. Later that month, the so-called signs faded to nothing. This would happen to Elisabeth again and again. And every time she failed to get pregnant, she worried about disappointing her mother. So I'm going to pause here and tell you a little bit about discovering Elisabeth in the archives. I didn't know very much about Elisabeth de Valois when I first started this project. I had written about Catherine, and so I knew that Catherine leaned on Elisabeth, but I didn't know the extent of it, and I really didn't know anything about Elisabeth. So I took myself to Paris to look at her letters, and I still remember sitting in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris at one of the long library tables, pouring through these volumes they have of 16th century manuscript letters. And when I found one of Elisabeth's letters to Catherine for the first time, I was completely taken aback by the handwriting, because it really looked like the handwriting of a teenage girl. How do I explain it? It was almost too perfect. It was like classroom handwriting. Like she had brought out her best handwriting in order to write to her mother. And at the same time, you could still see little signs that she was young. Like she mismanaged her margins a little bit, or there were some places where she didn't seem so good with her quill. So I think that was the moment where it really hit home to me just how young these girls were when they were sent off to marriage and to assume these political roles. So after that, I was really invested in finding the children in the archives, trying to be with the kids, to hear their voices. What was it like to be a little girl or a little boy in the 16th century at this time? And it was really hard to do because there isn't a lot that was saved by children. But I did find one little boy who's actually related to the story and made it into the book. He was Mary Stuart's half-brother, her older half-brother on her mother's side, the French side. So to give you a little context, when Mary Queen of Scots' mother left France and went to Scotland to marry James V, she left behind a little boy from her first marriage, and he was only 3. His name was Francois, and he was raised by his grandparents. And this was a really loving family. So by the time he was about 5 or 6, they had him writing little notes. He was actually dictating them, little notes to his mom, which they then shipped off to Scotland. And because she missed him so much, she kept the letters, and we have them. So I thought I would read a little bit because, little Francois de Longueville, he is a delight. I completely fell in love with him. And so I want you to hear his voice. And hopefully you'll fall in love with him too. There was so much to tell. There was eating and playing, sleeping and praying, the ponies, the chickens, the garden, Auntie, and Little Uncle. Little Uncle is the nickname he gives to his uncle who's 1 year younger than him, and they're playmates. There were games and day trips. There was feasting and fighting. He was a little boy in a grown-up world. Sometimes sounds and situations confused him. And I'm gonna stop there because it gets a little X-rated. But just imagine a little boy in bed and he's hearing the goings-on between a bride and a groom next door, and he has no idea what he's hearing. And he's dictating all of this to the scribe, who must have been just laughing behind his hand, and he sends it off to his mother. So I'll let you read the kind of X-rated version, but we have kids here. Then there was Grandpapa. Grandpapa was wonderful. Grandpapa took Francois for picnics, and they picked strawberries. Grandpapa went fishing and gave him a fish. Sadly, the servants ate it. Grandpapa hid in the closet while Auntie was putting him to bed. Grandpapa took him hawking, and he caught 2 birds. The heron was yelling, "Quah, quah," he said, and the kite was saying, "Let me go." Francois adored his grandpapa. I held his fingers so tight, he explained to his mother, and I didn't want to let go because I love him so much, and I am his darling. Grandpapa showed Francois how to hunt, and he wanted to show his mother too. The hawks fly up, Francois told her. They catch the herons and the kites. And as for himself, I run on my little horse. Fly, fly! He's just adorable. I love him. And I can tell you that no one missed his mother quite as much as Francois de Longueville. All right, let's move on to Francois's half-sister, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary was the daughter-in-law of Catherine de Medici and also Elisabeth de Valois' childhood friend. They called each other sister and were raised together in the French royal nursery. Born in Scotland in 1542 to King James V and his French wife, Mary became the reigning Queen of Scotland after her father's death when she was a tiny infant, just 9 days old. At the age of 5, she came to France to be raised with the French royal children, with the promise that she would one day marry Catherine de Medici's son, who was heir to the throne, the French throne. So from the time she was 5 years old, Mary Queen of Scots was slated to be the reigning Queen of Scotland and the Queen Consort of France. And by the way, she's also unofficially in line to the English throne. So this girl has the potential to be wearing many crowns, which is why she was so politically important in France, and that is also very important to Mary's sense of self. Mary knew she was important. Everyone knew she was important. In fact, everyone knew that Mary was the most important child in the French royal nursery, more important than Elisabeth de Valois, more important to the heir to France, more important than all of them. She already outranks all the other children and most of the people at court because she was already a reigning queen. Plus, Mary is just better at everything than all the other children. She's older, she's taller, she's prettier, she's more charismatic, she's articulate, she's better at dancing, better at riding, all of it. You know the kind of kid I'm talking about, right? Who's like really good at everything and becomes the bossy, popular kid on the playground. That was Mary, Queen of Scots. And she also has very powerful French relatives, the Guises, on her mother's side. Now, if you're a courtier at the court of France in the mid-1550s and you want to advance your career, you have to flatter the Guises. And the way you flatter the Guises is by flattering Mary, Queen of Scots. The thing is, the child Mary starts to internalize all this praise. She really begins to think that she is better than everybody else, and in a way she's right. But actually, the Guises taught her to think this way. That's where the trouble began for Mary. It started in her childhood. If Elisabeth de Valois was a prisoner of her body, Mary was a prisoner of her own mind and a deeply entrenched misogyny. She was really raised to be a queen consort, like an ornament or a jewel. And Mary thrived in this role. The problem is that she's also the reigning Queen of Scotland, but no one really thought to give her the skills she would need to rule that kingdom on her own. Everyone assumed that her husband was just going to do this for her. And frankly, Mary assumed that too. But then the year 1560 arrived. Unexpectedly, Mary's young husband, the new French king, died. And Mary found herself back in Scotland, expected to rule on her own, with very little support and almost no training. She was only 18 years old, like your average senior in high school, and she discovered that Scotland was hostile to her. The chief nobles were Protestant. She was Catholic. They saw her as a foreigner, a French woman, and they despised the idea of a woman on the throne. And let's face it, everybody in Europe at this time hates the idea of a woman on the throne. Even if a woman can accede to the throne, they kind of just tolerate it. No one actually likes it. They're always waiting for a man to step in. The thing is, Mary doesn't really like to rule either. So make no mistake, she wants to be the sovereign queen of Scotland. She wants to wear the throne, but she doesn't want to rule it. She doesn't know how. Mary struggled with a mind shift that was crucial for a young queen to survive. She was not resilient. She wasn't gritty. She has trouble pivoting from consort to sovereign. And this was very different than Catherine de' Medici or even Elisabeth de Valois, who understood how essential the pivot was. All Mary really wanted to do was to go back home. She wanted to go back home physically to France. She actually says it a few times. But more importantly, she wanted to go back home mentally to that exalted place that she enjoyed in childhood. She wants to be the queen consort again and have a powerful man rule Scotland for her. That's where she's shown the brightest, and that's where her skill set lies. Unfortunately, one of the lessons of young queens is that you can't go home again. Catherine and Elizabeth would learn this lesson, but Mary never really did. She tried to go home in a sense. She tried to arrange a marriage to another powerful king, but it didn't work. She was thwarted in her attempts by none other than Catherine de' Medici and Elisabeth de Valois. So much for family ties. Eventually, Mary found herself married to an English nobleman, Lord Darnley, a foolish boy who would cause her nothing but trouble. She made other mistakes too. As a child, Mary was taught to trust her French uncles, the Guises. They did stuff for her. She put it all in their hands. Once she gets back to Scotland, she does the same thing. She put her trust in an older, illegitimate half-brother on her father's side, a Protestant noble named Lord James. That was a huge mistake because Lord James was angling for the throne himself, but it takes Mary a little while to figure this out. Disaster bred disaster. And so we come to the final passage that I'll read today. I'll just set the scene a little. The year is 1566. Mary is 7 months pregnant. Her favorite secretary, David Rizzio, has just been murdered practically in front of her. The perpetrators include both her husband, Darnley, and behind the scenes, her half-brother, Lord James. Once again, a queen runs against the queen's paradox. She was pregnant. Mary was fulfilling a queen's first duty in carrying the heir. But her pregnancy left her particularly vulnerable to her attackers. So in the section I'm going to read, it's the aftermath of David Rizzio's death. Mary is struggling to know what to do, and here she's trying to work it out. Mary believed in a certain cosmic order, a clear hierarchy. God commands subjects to obey their princes, she had once announced. Her calculus was simple, even simplistic. First God, then the sovereign, then the Scots lords, her subjects. Didn't her nobles owe her uncompromising respect, whatever her will? In her mind, this was the way of things. It was also a puerile view of the world, and an emotional one, a remnant of her coddled childhood, and perhaps a misunderstanding of both the Scottish and French view of royalty. In Mary's mind, she was the queen and should get what she wanted. The English ambassador had noticed this facet of her character, at once tyrannical and childlike, although the envoy believed gender had something to do with it. She is a woman, he put it pithily, and in all things desires to have her will. Catherine de' Medici, on the other hand, had perceived how the grandees of her own kingdom loved her only with words. Their loyalty was contingent, and the sooner she recognized it, the sooner she could get what she needed. She could purchase their devotion for a time, but the work was never done. The ravenous wolves always demanded their feed. Elisabeth de Valois was learning this lesson too. When she lost her favorite French lady-in-waiting in deference to a Spanish one, she realized that sometimes a monarch must concede to powerful nobles, lest they make trouble. Obtaining a crown was a matter of birth or marriage. Retaining sovereign authority came down to hard work and sometimes tactical concessions. With every ounce of her being, Mary rejected this idea. God has elected the kings and commanded the people to obey them, she wrote sometime in early 1566. Raised in the Kingdom of France, where coronation was practically a sacrament, Mary basked in the notion that sovereigns were touched by God, as if sovereign power was part and parcel of their flesh, blood, and soul. Wasn't this divine order? Wasn't this natural? As the teenage queen consort of France, she hadn't witnessed the backroom dealings necessary to maintain that sovereign authority, the maneuverings behind the trappings and ceremony. And hadn't she tried to please her nobles? She had showered them with honors, estates, titles, and wealth. She had promised to maintain Protestantism in the kingdom. She had raised her bastard brother, Lord James, to the peerage as Earl of Moray as early as 1562, turning to him for advice, and yet he betrayed her. That was the problem with nobles, Mary believed. You bestow gifts upon them, and yet, like greedy children, they always want more. She hated to concede to these grasping nobles, these men so unworthy of her gifts, men who had slaughtered her secretary and threatened her with death, subjects both insubordinate and treasonous. Nonetheless, in the days following Rizzio's murder, Mary found herself pardoning Lord James. Shortly after she escaped to Dunbar, James had sent diverse messages to procure her favor. He claimed not to have known about the Rizzio plot and sought her forgiveness. After consulting her counsel, Mary concluded that she had no other choice. She had few forces at her disposal, and her physical condition, her pregnancy, left her weakened. On the cusp of giving birth, she could not withstand another attack. It was very difficult to have so many bent at once against her, she explained in a letter to France. Lord James had shown her his power. She would not risk seeing it again. And so, in spite of herself, Mary pardoned him. And that turns out to be the worst mistake she could have made. I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for that reading. That's very fascinating. So much of what you've described about this political system in which young girls are married off is very shocking to sort of modern feminist sensibilities. And you talk about the way that the three women there sort of tried to work within it. I'm wondering, was there any kind of feminist or proto-feminist sort of consciousness questioning, should this system be changed at that time?
No.
Yeah.
No, and actually it's because the system is really based on fertility. And also the lifespan is so short, right? So you actually only have a certain window when a girl could be fertile and potentially give birth to the heir. So no, there isn't really a questioning of this. And I mean, you even see mothers embracing this. And there's sort of a bittersweet moment where these mothers send their daughters away and they have to do it. And they don't want to do it, but they have to do it. But they also want it because it's good for their daughter and it's good for their families. So it's kind of, you see an ambivalence, a sadness, even as, they work within the system.
Yep. Thank you.
For these three women, are there any parallels today with famous women?
It's an interesting question because it really comes down to sort of what the patriarchy looks like, right? What I'm describing here is dynastic marriage. It would be, you'd have to sort of maybe set different terms, but part of it is, who is sort of the public figure of power, who's behind the scenes, who's just the wife. I mean, I thought a lot about Camilla, for instance, when, and Charles, that she's now a queen consort. England hasn't had a queen consort for a long time. And what was really interesting about Camilla is that she doesn't have the pressure of childbearing, right? The way that, say, Diana did, right? Kate has sort of taken that role from her. She's done that duty. So in some ways, I think that Camilla has kind of this plum position where she could actually not have to worry about this, chief duty of producing the next heir, and kind of redefine maybe the role that a consort, can play.
So I know your focus is more French history, but I was wondering when you were writing this if you felt internal, either from yourself or from editors, and including English queens at the time, like Mary I and Elisabeth I.
So the first draft of this book had 4 queens, with Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I of England, being the 4th queen. And Elizabeth Tudor is still very much in this book, but she got demoted to the 2nd tier, because when there were 4 queens, it was like everyone was fighting for space. So in the end, Elizabeth Tudor, and partially because so much has been written about Elizabeth Tudor, but Elizabeth Tudor got demoted. However, you can't tell this story without Elizabeth Tudor. Elizabeth Tudor's rivalry with Mary Queen of Scots later is famous, right? And it's already starting to brew at about this time. And in some ways, I think Elizabeth Tudor is a really interesting counterpoint to these 3 queens, because she's the only one who manages to kind of avoid the system by refusing to get married. But that what seems to me, at least, to be an incredibly well-informed decision, one that she vacillated on, partially because she's watching what's happening to all these women around her. One of the things that's really interesting about 16th century Europe is that there were actually so many women on the throne or behind the throne who were powerful. And so Elizabeth Tudor, kind of sees everything that's going on, and she can make her choices accordingly. And just to finish off with your question, Elizabeth Tudor was also lucky because Mary Tudor, her sister, came first. So she got to watch all the mistakes that her sister made and avoid them.
Elizabeth I was a really smart politician.
Very.
An Italian restaurateur across the street told me less than an hour ago that the Medici brought good Italian food to France, and France improved upon that. Any comment?
So Catherine de' Medici gets credited with so many things, which is really interesting because by the end of her life, she was hated and loved. I mean, France was really divided, and I think that the reputation of Catherine after the fact is that she's mostly hated. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book is give a more complex portrait of her. But one thing that happens with Catherine is that she does get credited with all these things, perfume and certain vegetables and evidently Italian food. And I don't know. Here's the thing. One of the reasons why Catherine survives at the French court as a young queen, and I didn't talk about her much today, but I do really talk about her in the book, is that she was really liked by her father-in-law, the French king, and he loved Italians. He thought Italy was the place, the cultural center of Europe. He really wanted France to actually beat Best Italy. So he's bringing Italian things in all the time.
Thank you. You mentioned that queen consorts are often approved of, and or even worshipped, I guess, in the best of circumstances for them, but that queen sovereigns are less so, under suspicion, and perhaps even despised. Yeah. My question is, how did the system, given that men are making most of the rules over history from that point back in time, how did the system evolve that a queen consort that becomes a widow becomes the sovereign?
So Catherine de Medici rules behind the throne, but the reason why it works is that she's not actually the sovereign. That, someone earlier said that Elisabeth Tudor was a really smart politician. Catherine was very smart too. So the king is actually her son. She has several sons who become king of France. But when she's at her most powerful as queen mother, it's when her first son, Francis, becomes the king. He's 15. And then when he dies, her son, who's 10, becomes the king. And he's so little, right, that obviously he needs help. And the particular situation is that France is, as I said, really divided between Protestants and Catholics. So none of the Catholics want a Protestant nobleman to be the regent, and none of the Protestants want a really rabid Catholic nobleman to be the regent.
Right.
So Catherine says, I'm the mother, so it makes sense for me. And she had to do a lot of convincing, but eventually everyone says, okay, well, this might be the best situation for a little while. And she's just good. And unfortunately, France actually, eventually, it does devolve into civil war. And so France is just really looking for these figures of stability. And Catherine is one of them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question. Hi.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. My question was, you mentioned that a woman's main power was through her fertility when she was a monarch. But once that a woman provided an heir, what are some things that a successful queen could do in court to both enhance and maintain her power? And I think you touched on that earlier, but...
Yeah, well, okay, so first of all, I would say that sometimes it's a little bit hard to say, because even though there are so many women in power in the 16th century, it's not like there were a lot of precedents, and not a lot of people following. But it is a constant form of negotiation, constant. And to bring in that demoted queen, Elisabeth Tudor, that is what she is so good at. She keeps telling her council, oh yeah, I'll get married one day. I'll get married one day. They say, okay. And that's how, she continues to kind of get them supporting her. Because that's what a queen really needs to have. Actually, all monarchs need to have it. They really have to have a lot of support. And so I think that's what needs to be done. And that's what Mary Queen of Scots doesn't quite understand. She thinks it's just about giving gifts to keep them happy. She doesn't quite know that you kind of have to have something on them. Right? And that it's truly a back and forth. And yeah, I actually feel sorry for her because she wasn't taught well. In some ways, she was raised to fail. I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'll go for another one.
Sure.
And so I'm wondering if you can weigh in on the debate that many academics and historians are having about to what extent is history shaped by individual people, sort of great people theory, versus the theory that history sort of has this arc that is going to be happening no matter who's in power. And you've structured your book as a biography here.
Yeah.
So sort of another way of framing that is just like, if these three women
Yeah.
hadn't lived, to what extent do you think history might have shaped differently in this period?
It's so hard to say, right? Because sometimes it comes down to the tiniest details, and I don't love that great person, I'm not going to say great man, but a view of history. One of my goals with this book was actually to not portray them necessarily as these great people, that they're extraordinary. I wanted to really portray them as women, complex women with flaws as well as, skills. And I also, as I was writing these stories up, I mean, it's history, but, telling it as a story, I really saw the ways sometimes like the smallest little thing could change the course of history. So if you take Henry II's death, for instance, so he's killed in this horrible jousting accident, and what happens is that it's supposed to be a celebration. He's jousting, and a splinter flies up, and it gets him right above the right eye, and he eventually dies of sepsis. But scholars have often wondered, how did that happen? There was something wrong with his visor, right? Either somehow he had forgotten to lower it, or there was a screw loose. But if there was a screw loose, that means that this is this palace revolution, which really in some ways leads to the French Civil Wars, turned on a screw, right? So it's hard to I don't know. I feel like there's something almost human-centered to think that humans, kind of direct everything. Sometimes I just think it's a sort of a combination of different circumstances that, leads to certain events or certain phenomena.
All right, thank you.
How are we doing on time here? Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Hi, Leah. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this ambivalence of the mothers sending off their daughters to have kids.
Right.
And you yourself made the comparison to trafficking.
Yeah.
Because I was struck. You suggested that we think about the Queen's paradox, but there was something that sounded a little like a little bit of a conflict in the way that you portrayed some of the childhoods as idyllic, and then suddenly being interrupted by having to go marry a 30-something man to have his kids. And the mother, yes, you talk about the mother's ambivalence. So I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about what you found about the status of patriarchy at that point and the role of the women in the system.
I mean, we're talking about extremely wealthy women. So when these women are raising their children, they're not necessarily in there, right? Like doing the stuff. They're not changing diapers. They're not necessarily playing, but these women are very, very, well, not all women, of course, but, there are many women who are very loving mothers. So Catherine de Medici was a very loving mother, and part of that is because she herself had a very difficult childhood. She was an orphan, and I definitely sense that there is this. She feels this need to give a lot of attention to her children, and no one was better tended to than those royal children. And some of the evidence of this is that a lot of them lived. It was not unexpected for a child in this period to die before the age of 7, which is one reason why kids aren't educated until the ages of 7 or older. But Catherine and Henry, her husband, do manage to get most of them through into young adulthood. So that is, one piece of evidence. The other thing that I would point to is, again, that little Francois de Longueville, the little boy. So he belongs to the Guise family, and the Guises are sort of notoriously ambitious. Later, they're portrayed as these, ultra-Catholic, ruthless murderers, and there is probably some element, certainly some parts of the family, but they were also really a loving family. And that little boy's grandmother, Antoinette, she was writing letters to her daughter in Scotland all the time. They had this really fierce correspondence. And there seems to be a kind of mindset where, these women, they marry into these families and they become part of the families, and their minds are very much wrapped around, the ambition of those families. So they want the families to succeed, and they know that the daughters are pawns in that effort to become great families or to inhabit the throne of various different countries. But that doesn't mean that they don't feel it when they have to send them away, or that they aren't worried for them in childbirth. It's so different than the way we think, although I suppose if we think about it, there's some, very harmful practices that we all just sort of accept, because that's just the way it is. again, I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but one of the things that I really did love about writing this book was was really hearing those human voices, was getting into the correspondence between mothers and daughters, and realizing that there's a cost to this, right? That's why the subtitle is The Price of Power, that, these families are they're doing whatever they can to hold on to power, but they're still paying a price for it. All right, I think that's it. Lily, are we right on time? Okay.
Right on time. We could do one more. For
Okay, if anyone has one more question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Just a quick one, and it's a little bit strange, but you've been looking at the correspondence of your three protagonists. Mary Queen of Scots must have changed languages at a certain point from French to English, or in her correspondence,
Yeah.
her domestic correspondence. Was there a change in outlook that came with that, or a change in any discernible change in?
No, she wrote in French whenever she could. That was definitely her favorite language. She writes in English because she becomes so obsessed with the English crown, right? And so she's constantly corresponding with England, whether it's Elisabeth I or other people in England. Change in outlook. Well, here's the thing that is sort of interesting. So Mary really saw herself as a French woman. She becomes obsessed with the English crown, partially because she thinks that that's going to win her a powerful husband who can then, help her solve all of her problems. I don't know if I can answer your question specifically about whether that changed her outlook, but that shift away from sort of associating herself with France to England was a huge problem for France, because France saw Scotland as a little bit of an outpost, right? And they really counted on her alliance. They don't want her creating a relationship with England. So, she never really thinks of herself as English. I would say, more importantly, she sees herself as Elizabeth Tudor's cousin, and therefore the rightful heir to the English throne. That's how she's thinking, maybe. Less in terms of nation and more in terms of her sovereign rights.
Was her English any good?
No.
No.
Was her English any good? It really wasn't. Well, again, thank you so much for coming. It's really a pleasure. I'm happy to sign some books.